Introduction to who I am. Again, I am the museum's exhibit and project coordinator. I am our sort of head researcher. I research the history of our vehicles, assist with the curation of the collection, and know a tiny bit about just about everything in the collection. I'm learning something new every day. So a brief overview of the museum's collection before we get into the meat of this talk. And I apologize in advance. I am down with a cold. There will be some coughing and some occasional sipping of tea during this seminar. So our collection is roughly 85 vehicles, ranging by year from 1898 to 2008. If you're wondering why roughly, well, it sort of depends on your definition of a vehicle. Is a pile of spare parts that could be eventually assembled into a vehicle. Does it count as part of our collection if it hasn't been on site for 20, 25 years? What if it's part of somebody else's collection that's on loan to us for a certain period of time? So we stick with that 85-ish figure because there's some constant flux. It's not rapid flux. Moving cars takes a lot of work because we are a small museum, but we do regularly have vehicles in and out. Some of you may remember our Honda Civic from a couple years back. We're working on some similar stuff coming in later this season. So, big question. If we are the Canadian Automotive Museum, how did we end up with an extensive collection of British vehicles? Certainly, for our current collections mandate, we would not be actively seeking out British vehicles. We're currently trying to really narrow down the focus to Canadian stuff and stuff with a really good Canadian provenance. But our British collection is mostly sort of, already gifted with that Canadian provenance, or at least some interesting Canadian adjacent stories, some of which I'm going to tell tonight. The museum has 12 British automobiles in the collection, of which half are Rolls-Royces. It's a brand that's a little overrepresented. And 6 motorcycles, covering a date range from 1912 to 1969. And we mainly ended up with these vehicles from 2 sources. Excuse me. First one is this fellow here in our red Alfa Romeo. Well, at the time it was his red Alfa Romeo. This is John A. Bud McDougald. He was a Toronto-based financier and banker, an avid collector of rare European sports cars and motorcycles of all kinds. His first car growing up as a teenager actually was a Vauxhall 3098, one of the most famous and high-performance British sports cars of all time, which is a pretty wild car to give for a teenager as their first car. Like, he was driving to his entry-level railway clerk job in a track-worthy supercar that was winning speed records in Europe at the time. It was a different time. He had a wacky upbringing. But he and his wife, Maude, in addition to being car fans, were also avid motorcyclists. More on Maude later. She's got an interesting backstory as well. And over the years, they accumulated a collection of more than 24 vehicles, most of which were actually donated to the Automotive Museum by his family after his death in 1995. Now, to his credit, McDougald kept excellent care of his vehicles. Most of the McDougald collection is still in running shape. However, he didn't really give a heck about documentation. So when we try to tell the story of McDougald collection vehicles, we tend to run into huge gaps. Often there will be, a single name of the owner he bought it from, and then nothing else in its record. So I'm part of the second generation of Automotive Museum researchers, very slowly and painstakingly piecing together the history of these vehicles. There are still huge gaps in what we know about the backstory of the McDougald collection. We're finding new stuff, sometimes on a monthly basis. On the opposite end of the spectrum, the other source of our British vehicles is the Craven Foundation. So they were a Toronto-based subsidiary of Rothmans, a British cigarette manufacturer, founded in 1972. And by the late 1970s, they had accumulated a pretty substantial library of Canadian motoring documents and archival material. They had also accumulated around 75 historical vehicles, mix of Canadian and European, covering the period of roughly 1900 to 1935. And if you're eagle-eyed, you will notice some vehicles that are currently on display at the Automotive Museum at this picture, or in this picture of the collection circa 1978. The Craven Foundation claimed at the time they had the largest historical collection of Canadian cars in the country, and that may well be true. This is at a time when the Museum of Science and Technology, the current sort of largest collection holder, was just starting out. Regardless, they had a really substantial collection of cars. They kept them in very good shape. They exhibited them at events all over the country. And their historical credentials were pretty excellent. They worked a lot with Hugh Durnford and Glenn Beckler, who are still some of the sort of most definitive Canadian car historians. Their book, Cars of Canada, even though it was almost 50 years out of date, is a reference work that I use on an almost daily basis. It is just that good. If you're interested in Canadian car history, you owe it to yourself to find a copy of this book. It is the best of the best. But in general, their cars were very well maintained and extensively researched and very well selected. Now, the Craven Foundation was disbanded in 1986 due to complicated internal company financial reasons, and they auctioned off their collection. Several of the vehicles that didn't sell in that auction, including a prominent chunk of our British motorcycle collection, were actually donated directly to the Canadian Automotive Museum, along with the Craven Library, which formed the basis of today's Beckler Canadian Automotive Research Library at the Canadian Automotive Museum. Now, to Craven's credit, they put a great deal of work, even as the organization was being shuttered, to keep the Canadian stuff of their collection in Canada. Several of the museum's prominent early Canadian cars, like our 1910 Mackay and our 1914 Brockville Atlas, you can see here, they were Craven vehicles. And I'd like to take this opportunity, because I've been looking for an excuse to do this for years, to do a little bit of myth busting. So there is a decades-old and very persistent rumor, dating from sometime in the 1980s, that the museum, when the Craven Foundation fell apart, bought some or all of their collection cash, then turned around, split it off, and resold most of the cars to private collectors overseas for a gigantic profit. We don't know where this came from. There's certainly no truth to it. We have fairly good records from the Craven sale. Every single vehicle the museum originally acquired from the Craven Foundation, but one, is actually still in our collection. And the big question is, well, we don't have any money now. We definitely didn't have any money in the 1980s. How the heck would we buy 75 plus extremely rare historical cars? So to make a long and complicated series of museum accessions short, what actually happened is the Craven cars came from several different sources. Some were donated from the foundation directly. Some were donated by members of the foundation who still had individual title to the cars in exchange for tax receipts. Made sense. Their organization was being shuttered. Everybody wants a tax receipt. Some were bought at auction by community members of the museum, Beckler and Durnford included, and then donated to us. And one single vehicle, just one, was bought by the museum. That was a 1926 Aaron's Fox fire truck, purchased for $2,500 in 1986 at the original auction, which has since left the collection. It has been rehoned, let's say, and returned to its original firehouse in Avon, New York, where it is currently on display at the local Firehouse Museum. So, long story short, I hope that busts the myth a little bit. On to the British vehicles. Bearing in mind, I am not an expert on the history of British automaking. I know a lot about the cars in our collection, but I'm going to be doing a lot of summarizing and simplifying and glossing down of general history here. Please be gentle. So, first in our collection are 1912 Rolls-Royce 4050, also known as a Silver Ghost. This is one of the most lasting and well-known British automobile designs in terms of cultural cachet and impact. Just look at the use of Rolls-Royce in movies, or Silver Ghost specifically in movies. They're kind of the archetypal car that's symbolic of ultra wealth in the British Empire and also British military power during the First World War. Silver Ghosts show up in Citizen Kane, Lawrence of Arabia, Gandhi, The Great Gatsby, Wonder Woman. Why? Why do they have this mystique? Well, rewinding a bit, some company backstory. In 1903 and 1904, a Manchester-based engineer specializing in electrical equipment and cranes by the name of Henry Royce starts building his own motor cars. He is inspired initially by the high-end French Decoville car. He buys one for himself, likes it, but thinks he can do better. And in 1904, a mutual sort of car club buddy introduces him to Charles Royce, who is an automobile enthusiast. He's the owner of one of the first cars in Cambridge in England, who happens to also own one of England's first car dealerships. So Royce and Rolls agree to go into business. Royce will design the cars, Rolls will sell them. They formally incorporate Rolls-Royce Limited in 1906, though their early sales are fairly modest because Royce is gearing up to kind of build a new model that will sort of be emblematic of all his design ideas. This fairly substantially powerful car, fitted with a big straight six engine, is nicknamed or dubbed the 4050. And for advertising purposes, the 12th 4050 off the line is painted silver and used as a demonstrator in all kinds of road trials and things all over England. And they call it, because of its color and because of the extreme stealthiness, that's the term used at the time, of its engine, the Silver Ghost. Incidentally, the original Silver Ghost, that 4050 number 12, is still in existence. It's still being driven. There's a photo of it at the bottom left there in, I think, circa 2008 or so. These are extremely long-lasting and sturdy cars, and the OG Silver Ghost is no exception. The company makes nearly 8,000 Silver Ghosts between 1906 and 1926, though they don't actually officially adopt the Silver Ghost name until 1925. And they generally develop a reputation for mechanical sturdiness and really excellent reliability, especially in very rough conditions. See, for instance, their extensive use on the Western and Eastern fronts of the First World War as staff and armored cars, most famously with Lawrence of Arabia in the Middle East. Now, our 4050 is this beautiful blue limousine named Ladybird. It's one of very few named cars in the collection. It's one of a very small number of fully enclosed 4050 limousines ever made. This is really built at a time when fully closed cars are not a popular design. And it belonged to Lady Flora McCrae Eaton, the matriarch of the Eaton's department store family. It was imported by her to Canada in 1913 and remained her signature vehicle for decades. Incidentally, the Eatons owned two other 4050s, Yellowbird and Bluebird. The other two were open touring cars, but this was her sort of hyper-personalized baby. It's got an extremely lavish interior, can speak from experience of very comfortable seats, glass fittings, a nice high roof and wide doors to fit the big hats and big dresses popular at the time, some electric lighting, which is still fairly rare, especially in the interior of a car in 1913. And bear in mind, this is like a high-end limo at a time when less than 1% of the Canadian population owns a car at all. This is an extremely, extremely luxurious car for a country that is fairly late to get into the automobile game. Now, Eden kept the car until 1952. It was sold to the American singer James Melton. It passed through several private collectors in the United States, and then the Craven Foundation acquired it in 1972 and brought it back to Canada. It's fairly well documented, as with most other Craven Foundation cars, and there's lots of photographic evidence out there of Lady Eaton using it. There's her in the bottom right in the big fur coat with her son attending the opera in about 1930, I believe, and the top left shows one of several of the family's chauffeurs posing with the car. So moving on from our Rolls, and we'll get back to Rolls-Royces later. We have a lot of Rolls-Royces. It's kind of inevitable. We're going to talk about a couple of them. Let's talk about Wolseley's, the car whose spelling and pronunciation has been the bane of my existence. So what is Wolseley? Well, Wolseley Tool and Motor Car Company Limited. They were the manufacturers of England's first locally built automobiles, and they're actually founded in 1901 as the automotive subsidiary of Vickers, Sons, and Maxim, most famous for the Vickers and Maxim machine guns. And thanks to this very strong industrial base and sort of pre-existing client network, they rapidly come to dominate the early British car market. By 1913, actually, Wolseley is the largest British-owned car company in Great Britain, second only in production to Ford. Now, technically speaking, Wolseley cars are never particularly cutting edge. They tend to be more focused on, mechanical simplicity, reliability, long-lastingness. But that reputation sits very well, and they're being locally produced, sits very well with the local elite, and they kind of become the stereotypical car of the British upper middle class. They're mildly popular in Canada. The company opens a dealership in Toronto in 1912, and they're actually the only British-made car to be shown at the 1912 Toronto Auto Show. And if you know anything about Canadian car history, the 1912 Toronto Auto Show is when basically every noteworthy Canadian car brand or later independent Canadian car manufacturer was featured or got their start. This was a huge deal. Cars that were featured in 1912 tended to go on to have interesting histories. So Wolseley opens a dealership in Toronto in 1912. And this particular Wolseley, the one in our collection, is one of only 174 sold by that dealership, or sold by Wolseley in general between 1910 and 1914 in Canada. These were never going to be huge sellers here. Bear in mind, a Wolseley touring car costs 4 times as much as a Ford Model T, while not really offering all that much better in terms of performance. But they are eminently respectable. They have a great reputation with the upper middle class. The Premier of Ontario in 1913 drives a Wolseley. These are cars that just scream rah rah British Empire. Now, the individual history of this car is a little bit odd. We know where it came from, but we don't know the individual owner. But we know who owned it subsequently. It eventually ended up in the hands of Canadian car historian Charles Neville. That's him at the bottom right with the dogs and the excellent mustache. He's standing in front of another Wolseley. And he's notable because he wrote the book on Wolseley cars in Canada. Like the book, it's conveniently titled Wolseley Cars in Canada. It is still the definitive reference. So he acquired this vehicle from a private owner whose identity we don't know, and eventually gave it to his longtime friend and car restorer co-worker, J. Gordon Eddington. That's him in the hat on the left. So he restored the vehicle, used it as sort of a family car for several years for special events, for summer driving, and donated it to the museum in 1987. It's in beautiful shape. It's been lovingly restored by two of the closest to Wolseley experts that exist in Canada for a brand this obscure. Incidentally, that's the original Wolseley dealership on the top right there. We were able to dig up some of the architectural plans, which was an exciting find. Up next, in the realm of sport, our 1926 Bentley 3-liter. So, British engineer W.O. Bentley was really into aircraft, especially during the First World War. He was a quite notable aircraft engine designer. And he sort of had this idea that, well, if we've been putting together these really high-end, lightweight engines for planes, why wouldn't they work well in a car? He starts work on this car project in 1919, but what eventually becomes known as the Bentley 3-liter wouldn't be ready for market until 1921. It's named after its very large 3-liter multi-valve engine, developed by Clive Gallup, one of Bentley's contemporaries. And it incorporates a great deal of aluminum and magnesium components in the engine and bodywork, as well as a light steel frame similar to contemporary high-end Peugeot and Mercedes racers. So this is a very technologically advanced car for its time, really quite exotic and cutting edge. And it almost immediately earns a great deal of attention from the press. The 3-liter chassis, incidentally, was substantially larger than most contemporary racing vehicles, partially due to the weight savings achieved by that aluminum and magnesium, leading Ettore Bugatti of Bugatti fame to famously dub it the world's fastest lorry, or fastest truck, if you don't speak British. So our 3-liter is a red badge, speed model. You can see the red badge on the nose there. This is the smallest and lightest of the 3-liters. The blue and green badges were touring models, a little bit bigger, a little bit heftier. And these speed models were extremely popular and very successful on the European racing scene in the 1920s. They win several of the early competitions at the Brooklyn Circuit, the Isle of Man time trials, and most famously, Bentleys, including 3-liters and 3-liter derivatives, win the 24-hour of Le Mans race every year between 1927 and 1930. Excuse me. Their most famous enthusiasts, of course, the British royal family, Kings Edward VIII and George VI, were both avid 3-liter fans, owners, and drivers. Now, our vehicle was originally owned by David Ross of Glasgow in Scotland, and while we have a great deal of maintenance records for it, we can tell you, for instance, when it got an oil change and when the cylinders were rebored. We don't know about really anything about what he used it for. We have no racing records for it, no pedigree, as it were. It's a McDougall collection acquisition, so the documentation we have is extremely spotty. What we do have related to it is this extremely intriguing historical photograph. Bit of a mystery. So when we contacted the W. Bentley Foundation for information about this car, they didn't have much in the records aside from the maintenance documents, but they did have this undated photograph, circa 1925, we can tell from the license plate, of a woman in a red badge 3-liter speed model Bentley in High Park in Toronto. We've been able to geographically place where this was taken down to the meter, but we don't know the identity of the woman, and records don't exist for tracking down the car. So if you know of a woman who owned a very high-end Bentley in Toronto in 1925, please let us know. We'd love to know more about her and her story, because this is a serious car to be driving in Canada at the time. Moving on now to motorcycles. So, Francis Barnett. In 1919, a couple of small-scale motorcycle manufacturers, Gordon Francis and his newly, well, father-in-law, Arthur Barnett, go into business together, building motorcycles. Both already worked for a company in Coventry that produced motorcycles of the Excelsior brand. Barnett had a side hustle going on, producing a brand of his own bike called the Invicta. So Francis signed on to first off help him sell his Romanian Victas and then develop something new under the Francis Barnett name. Now, during the First World War, Francis had worked as a motorcycle repairman on the Western Front and had a great deal of experience dealing with the weird sort of hodgepodge of motorcycles used by Allied forces. And specifically, the problem was that a lot of these early motorcycles were not even remotely standardized, often within individual manufacturers. Finding spare parts for them was extremely difficult, as was conducting repairs on the custom metal parts that made up their body framework. So Francis came up with this idea that, okay, what if we took all the complexity out of motorcycle building? What if we simplified a motorcycle's frame, simplified this incredibly complex part down to basically tinker toys, pipes and bolts? And he came up with a system that was essentially assembling a motorcycle out of a metal truss. These bikes were first exhibited in 1923 and said to, in the contemporary advertising, be built like a bridge. As it turns out, this idea of assembling a motorcycle out of pins, bolts, and straight pipe worked exactly as well as Francis was hoping. This was an extremely simple and sturdy and cost-effective and reliable way to build a motorcycle. The company actually put together a film strip at the time showing an entire motorcycle being assembled by hand from scratch in under 20 minutes by a single person, proving just how simple these bikes were. You could literally put one together from loose pieces with a screwdriver and a wrench, and that was about it. We haven't been able to find a copy of that film strip. If you know one out there, please let us know. I'd love to see it. So generally speaking, Francis Barnett bikes were only modestly powerful. These are simple, reliable, do-it-yourself type economy bikes. Our 1931 Blackhawk is no exception. It's got a modestly powerful, fairly fuel-efficient Villars engine. And this one comes from the McDougall collection, but crucially, it is not Bud McDougall's motorcycle. It is his wife, Hedley Maude McDougall's motorcycle. She, like Bud, was quite fond of motorcycle touring. She was also an Olympic figure skater, so the only good photo we have of her is her in her 20s in her Scottish-themed Olympic figure skating outfit. But by all accounts, she and Bud did regular motorcycle tours all over the country in a pair of matching Francis Barnetts. However, the McDougall collection records being what they are, we don't have any photographs of her on her motorcycle, nor do we know where she got it from. We know that Francis Barnett did have a Toronto dealership in the 1930s, but we don't have anything like a paper trail. So, classic historical mystery we're trying to solve with a McDougall collection vehicle. Now, you'll recall earlier I said we were going to be doing some more Rolls-Royce, so here it is, some more Rolls-Royce. This is our Rolls-Royce 2025. So when Rolls-Royce had produced the Silver Ghost, they'd also produced a vehicle called the small car. This was kind of a scaled down, slightly more compact companion vehicle, also technically dubbed the Model 20. Similar to the Silver Ghost in technical design, sharing a lot of parts, but a little bit more compact, a little bit more low end. The 2025 here was the next generation small car. It was almost literally the Model 20 with a slightly bigger engine. Not on paper a particularly impressive car by the standards of Rolls-Royce. However, fortunately for the company, or maybe unfortunately, the design was launched in 1929, right as the Great Depression sweeps the pocketbooks of all the millionaires of Europe. So suddenly the idea of the company making a slightly inexpensive luxury car is really, really, really incredibly appealing. It's priced the same as the earlier Model 20. It's got slightly better horsepower. And the car, well, they made almost 4,000 of them over the 1920s and 30s. And that sale alone really helped the company stay afloat just barely during the worst of the Great Depression. Now, crucially, the 2025 is a little bit different in philosophy than the Silver Ghost. The Silver Ghost is a chauffeur-driven car. It is often designed, because bear in mind, these cars are not built with standard bodies. You have to custom order your bodywork. So when Lady Eaton got Ladybird, she had to sit down and say, I want a closed limousine. When somebody bought a 2025, they had to say, well, I want a touring car, I want a sedan, I want a closed car. But these are fundamentally vehicles that are designed to be owner driven. Their handling characteristics are a fair bit better. They're a little bit more technically simple. Crucially, though, and one of the weird quirks of these vehicles, because they were so popular during financial hard times, is often the very wealthy people who bought them said, okay, I've saved on the car, now let's make it look fancy. So you very often find in collections 2025s with really oversized and overweight bodies that look fancy but have absolutely terrible performance. Our 2025 is fairly bog standard. It's got relatively simple coachwork by Barker. They're one of the longtime Rolls-Royce collaborators. And it was owned by business tycoon, a Toronto-based business tycoon, J.P. Bickle. He's known for founding the Famous Players Film Company, founding what would eventually become Avro Canada, builder of aircraft, most famously the Avro Arrow, and also of particular local interest as being one of the co-owners of the original Toronto St. Patrick's, a local hockey team that did quite well and rebranded as the Toronto Maple Leafs in 1927. So this vehicle has impeccably good Toronto provenance. This is a vehicle of really, really deep Torontonian roots. Now, it's a McDougall car, so we have some big gaps in our knowledge of it, but less than usual. One of the nice things about it being owned by the Bickle family is they're still around, and their descendants kept a lot of photographs from the family. So we have some details on this car. For instance, we have a photograph of what we think is it being delivered at the rail yard with Bickle inspecting it as it's rolled off the train car. We're not 100% sure because it's unlabeled, but we do have that. We also know, for instance, the Bickle family owns several Rolls-Royces and that they kept a large rock in their front driveway to help Bickle's daughters climb in and out of the car. Frustratingly, though, we don't have any photographs of Bickle with the car or even any photographs we can reliably match with this vehicle. Such is the nature of finding historical car photographs. It's a task we're constantly trying to do and a task we're constantly struggling with. But again, McDougall collection car, so it is in beautiful shape. It's been very well preserved. It's still functional. It is a lovely, lovely, very shiny piece of kit. And one of the easiest of our Rolls-Royces to move around, which, given that we have to move all of our cars by hand, a slightly lighter Rolls-Royce is a huge advantage for the sake of, for instance, my back and the backs of all of our volunteers. Now, back to motorcycles into the 1950s, with probably the least photogenic vehicle in our collection. We have been trying to take a good-looking photo of our 1952 Velocette LE Mark II for years. Doesn't matter the lighting, this thing will always just kind of look like a slightly drab tin lunchbox to me. But it's an interesting motorcycle with an interesting story. So what eventually becomes Veloce Limited begins as a small family bike producer in Birmingham, founded in 1896 at the very height of the early sort of safety bicycle boom, then sweeping basically both sides of the Atlantic, Canada included. And by 1905, they'd kind of gotten a little bit out of the bicycle market. They'd acquired a local engine manufacturer and were unsuccessfully producing a wide range of small motorcycles. It wasn't really until 1910 that they found their footing, and that was with a small, very lightweight, and very reliable two-stroke motorcycle called the Velocette. And this Velocette brand eventually evolves to become really one of the most widely known and respected compact two-stroke motorcycle designs of the 1920s. These are not huge, incredibly powerful motorcycles, but they are made to a very high standard of craftsmanship. They're really some of the greatest long-range touring bikes available if you're looking for fuel efficiency and simplicity of use at the time. So this is the high end of the simple end, if that makes sense. Now, post World War II, the company is looking to diversify their market. There's a big desire for more small, inexpensive commuter bikes. Gas rationing and tire rationing, among other things, are leading to a growing popularity in motorcycles in general. And the company comes out with a pretty revolutionary design, the 1948 LE, or Little Engine. And that is basically the direct predecessor or a slightly earlier version of this exact bike. So it's got an internal box frame, this very distinctive squared off pressed aluminum casing with a felt lining in the inside for heat and noise protection. But the real clincher is the little engine itself. The big revolutionary thing with this vehicle is that the engine, the drive shaft, and the transmission elements are all built into one single solid part. This is dramatically lighter and quieter and easier to maintain than any previous motorcycle engine. It's really easy to top up the oil, for instance. The slight problem is the machining for this is incredibly expensive. So while technically speaking, this is really a masterwork of a light commuter bike, price-wise, the company is almost but not quite losing money on every single Velocette LE they sell, and they're never a commuter success. However, the combination of ease of maintenance, good reliability, and very quiet operation is really, really useful for police work. So eventually, more than 50 different British police forces adopt Velocettes. And this leads to them developing a strange and very enduring reputation. First off, they're a weird looking motorcycle. They're instantly recognizable in police colors or otherwise. And second off, British police or motorcycle police officers at the time are not required to salute each other like other police officers at the time were. They are instead only required to nod to passing police officers. So naturally, these became known as noddy bikes. That's Noddy, not the other way around. And linger as sort of a popular symbol of 1950s British policing and the classic sort of Bobby on a motorbike look. Now, our Velocette was a rare Canadian sold model. There was never a Velocette dealership in Canada, but there were several companies selling them, including Sturgis and Sons in Hamilton, who still exist today as Sturgis Motors. So thank you to them for digging into their archives and finding a photo of the dealership at the time. This photo was taken roughly when this motorcycle would have been sold in 1952, but alas does not feature any Velocettes on it. And this motorcycle was eventually acquired by the Craven Collection in the 1970s, and again donated to us. This is one of the lot of motorcycles left over after the auction that came directly into the museum in 1986. So it's a little better documented, less Canadian provenance, but still an interesting Canadian piece or Canadian sold piece and an interesting technical story in our motorcycle collection. This is certainly out of place among our other big sort of 1930s racing motorcycles that dominate the motorcycle collection. Lastly, we come to probably the single rarest and most esoteric car in this talk, our Vauxhall Wyvern station wagon. And by my calling it a Vauxhall Wyvern station wagon, if you're a Vauxhall fan, you will know that is a very strange thing to say because Vauxhall never made Wyvern station wagons. More on that in a second. So some backstory. Alex Wilson and Company, later the Vauxhall Iron Works, was founded in 1857 in London as a manufacturer of plumbing equipment and maritime engines. Later they get into industrial equipment in a big way. And they build their first car in 1903, move out to Luton, and rebrand as Vauxhall Motors in 1905. Now, under the engineering guidance of a guy by the name of Lawrence Pomeroy, who basically joins the company as a temp, ends up filling in for the lead designer while he's out sick, and comes up with some really brilliant ideas, they make the jump to a huge range of extremely successful sports and high-performance cars. Most prominently the Vauxhall 3098, an almost all aluminum car, widely considered to be the finest British sporting vehicle of all time. This success lasts until just after the First World War, when the market for really high-end performance cars in the UK somewhat collapses. The company is looking to diversify their market share. They're running low on cash. They've kind of really only been focusing on ultra high-end performance cars at this point, and they're looking to be bought out. And the company that buys them out is, in fact, General Motors. And GM reorients Vauxhall towards capturing the British middle range market. So over the 1930s and leading into the Second World War, Vauxhall goes from being a manufacturer of racing vehicles to a manufacturer of small, reasonably inexpensive, but technologically very cutting edge passenger cars. And they keep up their tradition of kind of high tech with some really advanced features for commuter vehicles at the time. Things like synchromesh gearboxes, GM's very advanced but not actually very good Dumaresq suspension, unibody construction, overhead valve engines. So post World War II, the Wyvern is Vauxhall's kind of triumphant return to the civilian market. It is basically the pre-war car with tiny cosmetic updates. This you see all around the world as car companies kind of shift very quickly from war production back into peacetime production and just keep making whatever they were making before the war. It's got a kind of anemic pre-war four-cylinder engine. They're infamously not very fast, not exactly a track car anymore, but they are economical, they're fuel efficient, sort of cheap and cheerful. They're available in a wide range of colors and with lots of fancy extras. Very, very popular at the time, and the company builds more than 100,000 of them between 1951 and 1957. A weird little Vauxhall feature that I find quite endearing and quite odd and emblematic of how strange these cars are is the hood. As you'll see from the diagram, it opens from the sides or is entirely removable if you want to access that teeny weeny little engine kind of floating in the middle of an otherwise very large empty engine bay. Now, calling our Vauxhall Wyvern a British car is technically cheating because our Vauxhall Wyvern is not a British car. English-built Wyverns were unibody and famous for it. The company really advertised this a lot. Ours is an Australian Wyvern. And Australian Wyverns were not unibody. They look very similar. They're mechanically almost identical, but basically the Australian factories for the company were not advanced enough to produce unibody cars. And the general consensus was that the unibody construction, while sturdy enough for British roads, was not sturdy enough for rough outback roads. And the body on chassis model, while a little bit lower tech, had a bit more give to it, was easier to replace parts. So they stuck building kind of lower tech Wyverns in Australia. So technically, this is an Australian car of English design, produced in Australia by an American-owned company and fitted with a British-built body for use by a Canadian in Bermuda. So what the heck is this car? Well, it is genuinely the only production, factory-produced Vauxhall Wyvern station wagon ever built. It is one of one, a completely unique car. And, well, the backstory is, as far as we know, at some point in the 1950s, Sam McLaughlin, Colonel Sam McLaughlin, the then semi-retired president of General Motors Canada, wants a car for use on his estate in Bermuda. Cedar Lodge. That's Sam and his wife Adelaide on the left and center in the photo on the left there, and Cedar Lodge proper on the right. Now, in the 1950s, Bermuda had only just, for the very first time, legalized cars as a concept. But because the island had a very small road network and shipping stuff on and off was very expensive, there were some very strict legal limits on the size, shape, engine displacement, and volume of car you could bring onto the island. So, to the best of our knowledge, essentially what Colonel Sam did was put out an internal mailer to GM and say, what do we have that is as close as possible to the Bermudan requirements, has a teeny weeny engine, and can be cheaply modified? And the Australian Wyvern, with its detachable body and chassis, its teeny weeny engine, and its relatively compact floor plan seemed to be perfect. So it was built in Australia, just a bog standard chassis, shipped up to Grosvenor Carriage Company of London, and they converted it into this beautifully executed wooden bodied station wagon. But for a one-off, custom car, for one thing, it looks like a production car. This is not particularly fancy, but for another, it is incredibly bare bones. It's missing pretty much every single extra you could think of in a car of this type. It is really just a big box added on to the back of a Vauxhall Wyvern. There's no headrest, there's no armrest, there's no cup holders, there's not even a cigarette tray, which is wild for a 1950s car. Most baffling to me, though, is that the windows don't roll down in any way, which I would have thought for a a car you're using in your island retreat to shuttle people to and from the harbor or from the airport, bit of a baffling choice. But it is genuinely a one-off car. We know of no others like it, and it really ended up in Canada almost by chance. William Jones, a Bermudan with Canadian family, happened to visit the McLaughlin family estate sale sometime in 1971, 1972, saw this car, realized roughly what it was, had it shipped to Canada in the late 1970s, and his family actually donated it to us in 1982. So thank you to the Jones family for getting us this car. It is a true, bizarre, absolutely the jewel of our British collection, even though it doesn't look like much, and we're delighted to have it. So that brings an end to this very brief summary of the British vehicles in the museum. I know I've glossed over some of the really rare and exotic ones, like our royal visiting cars, but I'm unsubtly hinting here that you should come and see the museum to see the really intense ones, and try to cover some of the stories that don't often get covered in our exhibits in detail. So I'll open the floor up to questions and comments and concerns, and I'm sure somebody is about to fact check me on some of my British car history. I apologize again. I'm still finding my way, but thank you all very much. How are we doing, Alex?
Good. It looks like Alex Gates actually had a little comment about the Eaton photo. So, for those of you that don't know, that Alex is the former director of the museum, and he just had a comment about that photo from Lady Bird, that it's the College Street Eaton store opening.
Right. You're right.
Mhm.
Got me. You caught me, Alex.
Thanks,
Yes.
Alex.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely correct. But like, imagine taking a limousine to the opening of a store. It's such a portrait of a different time. I really respect Lady Eaton. She had a custom car with a lot of drip, and she used it for long after it would have been popular or stylish as a design. It was her car, and she customized the heck out of it and used the heck out of it, and I respect that.
Yeah, and then in regards to Janice's question here, well, Dumaresq was speaking, I did do a little looking into the British television series Heartbeat from the 60s, and it looks like the bike that they used was actually a Francis Barnett, which is around 30 years later than the one we have in our collection. So not the bike you were asking about, but still connected.
Yeah. The 1960s connection for Francis Barnett, somewhat unrelated, Maureen, but it's come up a lot. There was a huge collectors community for 1960s era Francis Barnett bikes. And one of the real difficulties we've had in researching our Francis Barnett collection, because we have two of them, the Bud and Mode McDougall bikes, is that the amount of material out there from the 60s basically drowns out everything earlier. There are relatively few collectors interested in the 20s and 30s era of the built like a bridge bikes. So we've had some genuine difficulty actually finding original company materials. You may have noticed some of the photo credits on that bike are, I believe, from an Australian enthusiast website. And yeah, they're a very popular brand, but they're not popular in the era that our bikes belong to, if that makes sense.
We have another question here from Maureen. So she asked that we mentioned the 1912 Canadian Auto Show. She's assuming that the McLaughlin Buicks were proudly displayed at that show. Is that correct?
Oh yes, they had a huge stand. I don't remember off the top of my head the exact number of different marks of car displayed at the 1912 Auto Show, but it was more than 100. It was a gigantic affair. Loads of people, like thousands of people, showed up for the sole novelty that the almost the entire auto show was actually electrically lit. That was a big deal at the time, that the whole lighting for the entire show was done by electricity. But yeah, essentially every notable Canadian car brand at the time shows up. You get Brockville Atlases, you get the Peck Electric. It's the very last time that we know of that the Fanshawe, Canada's first electric car, was displayed. You get the original Galt car, which was later redeveloped into Canada's first hybrid. You get Wolseley, you get Detroit and Rauch and Lang, and loads of big electric auto manufacturers from the States. I believe Russell had a showing there. It is just, there was really extensive newspaper coverage, and every single time we research a car from this period, it either got its start at the 1912 auto show or fell apart as a result of a poor showing at the 1912 auto show. This was like a really make or break event for dozens and dozens and dozens of otherwise, some of them very later, very large manufacturers, some of them completely forgotten, failed manufacturers, but everybody who was anybody in the car industry was at this show, McLaughlin included.
All right, thank you. And then we have another note from Peter here. He just noted that following the photo of the Rolls-Royce, there's a black and white shot of another Rolls-Royce, and he thinks it's a 20 horsepower baby Rolls.
That would track. Yes, we know the 2025 we have, I think, was the largest of Bickle's cars. I believe I seem to recall he had three Rollses, so it would make sense that yeah, they'd have a big 2025 tour and then a slightly smaller baby Rolls, maybe for use up at the cottage or about town. But yes, thank you. Good catch. The Bickle stuff is frustrating because we've got the photos of the chauffeurs and we've got the photos of the families posing with the car in such a way where you can't see what the car is. There's a great deal of photographic evidence, but it's photographic evidence showing all the wrong stuff. It's out there, but it doesn't answer the questions we have about Bickle's car or fill the gaps. It's almost more frustrating than the other McDougald cars where we have absolutely nothing. Is for this one we have all these clues, but nothing to tie them all together.
Great. Do we have any other questions from anyone? So, Demerik, I know we didn't fill all of the British vehicles into this talk. I'm wondering, for you, what would be your favorite in the collection? I know it's hard. I hate it when people ask me that question too, but
It's
do you have
tough.
a favorite British vehicle in the collection?
I think I have a favorite British vehicle story at least. For surprise, surprise, another Rolls-Royce, our 1914 Rolls-Royce, the one used by the Prince of Wales, later Edward VII in his royal tour. Yeah, the story that goes with it is that Edward was forced to borrow the car. The British royal family did not have a touring automobile available in Canada at the time. So he borrowed the car from a local cigarette factory owner in Montreal, I believe, and was really irritated that the royal family had been forced to borrow a local automobile. But the famous story is, he was in his early 20s when this royal tour happened. He was a bachelor, very eligible, quite handsome, a world-renowned historical figure. And security cordons had to be established in several of his big city visits because of screaming teenaged fans. And at one point, I believe in Toronto, a teenage girl broke through the Royal Marine security cordon, climbed into the backseat of the car, kissed him on the lips, and begged him to marry her. And he was quite shaken by the whole experience and very upset that security had failed in this way. I don't know what happened to the teenage girl, but always feels like Beatlemania to me. And it makes me wonder, if that had any impact on all of the later Royal Touring cars in Canada being closed cars. Quite possibly.
Yeah, as soon as you said you had a favorite story, I knew where you were going with that one. It's
This
such
is
a good one.
the
I was
British car
talking to
story.
someone, yeah, I was talking to someone about that today. Janice just asked if we're going to the British Car Day at Bronte Provincial Park on Sunday for the 40th anniversary. We are not actually, unfortunately. Um, yeah, we were actually just at Cobble Beach last weekend, so we can share a little news. We haven't had a chance to post it yet, actually. Not a British car, but the PM's Buick actually took home second at Cobble Beach in its division, pre-80 Canadian vehicles and debut. But yeah, I wish we were going. I'll check my calendar and see if I can drop by, but it's been a busy couple weekends for us at CAM. And then we've got a question from Mike Cole asking about the Rolls-Royce They still have extensive records, asking if that would help with the Bickle cars.
It has, yes. We have drawn on those records for every single one of the Rolls-Royce vehicles in the collection. The difficulty is a lot of the Rolls-Royce records that are preserved are things like factory build sheets and body blueprints. So we can often trace extremely technical details from the early ownership of the cars, but not actual usage details. We have the factory build sheets. We have reproductions of the big checklist of optional extras and the list of colors that they selected. In some cases, for some of our roles, yeah, we literally have copies of the blueprints that went into the body shop saying, here is the exact car, and you can look at it, it matches one to one with the car on display, but it's only technical stuff. Any non-technical material associated with the cars is preserved by the Rolls-Royce enthusiast community. And so while they've been able to fill in a lot of the gaps on a lot of our Rolls-Royces, it's not 100% coverage. It's certainly been an extremely valuable resource, and it's helped us learn a lot about where our cars came from, but it only really covers up until the moment where the car leaves the factory. Everything else is really up to whether or not somebody saved those documents. Great question, though. We've done similar things with most of our European sports cars, being able to find the enthusiast communities that track the details of these historical vehicles. And in several cases, we've had situations where, you know, the Alfa Romeo museum in Italy knew more about our Alfa Romeo than we did, and had substantially more documentation on our car and sort of said, oh, that one. Yeah, okay. Yeah, here's our file. So most of the exhibit came from that one source, because they had sort of a full dossier on the car that had never made its way overseas before. So yeah, those kinds of car club sources are incredibly valuable to us, and we use them whenever possible because they're really our best way to turn up things that don't exist in the public record, or obviously exist in the public record.